I will begin.
Yeah.
I'm going to go refer back to that seminar that we were at 2 days ago. One of the other maxims was, there is nothing as difficult as another person. Right? And in the background to this presentation is the observation that, and for your congregants, for everybody that you meet, you are another person. Right? So you are a source of difficulty, as we all are for each other, to your congregants and intimate partners, friends, relatives. And coming back to that thing that Will mentioned earlier about putting up the shield, I said, okay, and you put the person in the situation where Will has changed, but he doesn't want me to talk about it. It's probably worse than that, because particular sets of people will say, oh shit, what have I done wrong? Right? So suddenly my projections onto Will have really made Will's internal problems about me and a problem for me. So when you're working with people, this is the huge complexity of the system that we're in. This presentation, Tim asked me to talk about spiritual bypassing. And spiritual bypassing is a concept put together or invented by a psychologist and Buddhist teacher named John Welwood. And Welwood noticed that from his dual perspectives as psychologist and spiritual teacher, that there were behaviors that he could see in the people that he was teaching, which could be looked at through the psychological lens as a problem, right? And the more he looked into this, he became convinced that his students, some of his students, are using spiritual doctrines, spiritual attainments, the pretense to spiritual attainment, as a mask for what we would call psychological difficulties, right? And he thought of it, and still thinks of it, as far as I can see, to the most part, as, coming along the spiritual path and going, whoa, heading off into neurotic land. And I think it's a really useful concept, right? But Tim asked me to talk about it, and the more I sat down and thought about it, the more I came to a similar conclusion here, that really, we're talking about a model of people's behavior. And we're talking about different ways of relating to, and different ways of understanding people's behavior. So I thought it would be much more appropriate, and I would be able to believe in what I was saying more if I expanded it out a little bit. So this is Welwood's statement of the problem, and certainly around the Buddhist area, this is one of, and the Wilbur area, this is one of the classic statements that I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the Carlsberg commercials. I think it was Carlsberg. Carlsberg refreshes the parts that other beers cannot reach. Yeah. Okay, so here we have two brews, which are, in Welwood's terms, addressing different thirsts or different needs.
Spirituality and psychotherapy, the complementary Carlsbergs.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So, so that's a statement of the problem of what we're going to be talking about from a psychologist, Buddhistic teacher. This is from the wonderful Kabir, and I'm not going to read it to you, but can you see it back there or not? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Otherwise, I'll recite it. But I think it's a lovely one. So what our friend is talking about there, back in the 15th century, from a Sufi point of view, is the ability to hide in in the garb of spiritual practice, and to not only to hide, but in that last line, actually, you're going in a hearse to the country of death, bound hand and foot. You're constricting yourself in spiritual development, and that is very similar to Wellwood's conception. What's happening here is getting in the way.
Reminded me of the comment or the criticism, at least, the one thing that's highlighted in Pagel's Gnostic Gospels, talking about the early Gnostics looking at their proto-Orthodox counterparts as being waterless canals.
Yeah. And this is a theme that comes up in spiritual schools over and over again. The Mahayana in Buddhism, all over the place.
Yeah,
Luther,
word of the Lord instead of spirit.
all over the place. Okay, so what we will do today, echoing Will here, describe the territory? No, we're going to be describing some maps here. Okay? We'll take some views through those looking glasses, and hopefully, this is where I'd be looking for feedback from you guys on the people that you meet, or on your own experience, to see if any of it strikes a bell, or I don't know, strikes a glass. We're going to take another look at Fowler, but from a slightly different, from quite a different aspect. Fowler came from the school of Lawrence Kohlberg, along with Robert Keegan, and all three of these people have 6-stage developmental theories. They really like the 6. And reading Fowler and reading Keegan, the two ways of thinking, and I think Kohlberg as well, show huge similarities. And folks that have done later work shine an interesting light on these stages, because what's happening in the stage can be seen as a change in the ability to perceive and work with complexity, right? And we can talk about that as a development of epistemic position, what it means to know, for example, I think is implicit in Fowler's stages. Keegan's stages for sure. I don't know Kohlberg's well enough to say. But so what I'm going to do is we'll take an inside-out look at Fowler, looking at the epistemic positions, which arguably are underneath the first 5 of Fowler's stages. Forget stage 6.
So I remember I had lunch the other day, and I think we came to an agreement that for a Gnostic church, probably clarifying what it is to know is probably pretty key.
Yeah. Episteme is sort of floating around there.
Yeah. So I didn't know I had a philosophy teacher in the room, so I'm a little bit intimidated, but we'll deal with that as we go.
You need to do some anxiety management.
Yeah, I know. I'm managing it. It's all right.
Okay,
I just hadn't anticipated it. So after that, after the theory bit, we'll take a break. That's the plan, and we'll see how the timing works out.
Sure.
And then we'll get into practicalities, what to look for. And I didn't know Vivian had, I didn't know your friend, I can't remember his name. Elliot's questionnaire was helping to sort out this, the severity of, if you like, dysfunction in people's thinking. Can we deal with it spiritually? Can we deal with it developmentally? Do we have to? Is the psychoanalytic or psychotherapeutic model better for these things?
Or medication.
Or medication.
Sometimes,
sometimes medication is the best alternative. Okay, so so that's what we're looking for, and then what can we do in these areas, right? If we're working in each of these lenses. Okay, so the maps that we're going to use are Wellwood's map, and this is a better statement of it here, of his what he actually means by bypassing, that using spiritual ideas or practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psych wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. And these are the types of things that the 3-2-1 exercise can help expose in ourselves, right? Robert Masters is quite explicit in saying that this gets in the way of spiritual progress. It's an obstacle, and well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Chogyam Trungpa is a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, but he wrote a book back in the mid-'80s, I think, called Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. And he looked at different problems on the spiritual path, if you like, as seen from Buddhism, as being really a materialistic mode of relating applied to spiritual ideas and practices. So it's almost the inverse of Wellwood's way of looking at it. So whereas Wellwood is seeing psychological avoidance in the dawning of spiritual practices, particular spiritual practice in particular ways, Trungpa is seeing materialistic attachment to spiritual practices and ideas. So that's going to be looking at it from inside a particular spiritual tradition, sort of inside. And it'll be interesting to see if there's what resonances there are with Gnosticism. I'd be fascinated to hear. Mark Epstein is a psychiatrist. He's an MD, a psychiatrist, who is also a Buddhist. I think he was a Buddhist before he was a psychiatrist. And he's got a substantial, reasonably popular, reasonably accessible literature on looking at the different ideas of self and pathology through the Buddhist and through the psychoanalytic lens. And he's a lovely writer as well, very, very humane person. Wonderful books. But he sees this as the production of self-created suffering, so which is quite a nice hybrid statement, which is very consistent with both views. And we come back to the man who you're probably getting sick of, James Fowler, as our final lens.
Amusingly, we didn't plan to both be talking about Fowler.
Well, no, but I was really happy when you told me you had, because this whole idea of, first of all, the idea of development, and then the idea of how do we conceptualize that development? How do we conceptualize spiritual progress, psychological health, human growth, all of these things which it's so difficult to compartmentalize, right? So I know if I look at my own experience, what of that is psychological, what of it is spiritual, what of, it's quite an interesting problem. Okay, so how are we doing? 1:54? Might even be ahead of time here, I don't know.
Really?
So I'm
Really?
you think I'm dragging, do you? Yeah. Questions. Please yell out questions. I might delay them and we'll put them up on the board for later, but certainly happy to take them as we go along. Could have said that closer to the end. But all right, so let's look at spiritual materialism, Trungpa's thing. Central to Buddhist psychology is the concept of attachment. Attachment is sort of synonymous with grasping, and it's the driver of suffering in Buddhist terms. All right? And an interesting little thing that I came across the other day, a monk came up to the Buddha and said, "I want happiness." And the Buddha is reputed to have said to him, "Forget want, that's grasping. Forget I, that's ego. and you're left with happiness. Yeah? This was in the Buddha's Jewish period. Yeah? So it is that central, that sense of being a separate person, a separate entity, and wanting that which is not here now, or wanting that which is here now not to be here now, is central to the whole Buddhist dynamic. Now, Trungpa pointed out, of course, that it's not just, as we generally hear about it here in the West, it's not just attachment to owning material objects or positions of power or any of that. We can apply it to damn near anything. We can get attached to pretty much anything. So owning or not having it, right? Being attached to, I can be attached to owning things, I can be attached to not owning things, right? That defines me. Ditto, I can be attached to belonging to a church. I can be attached to the fact that I don't belong. I am unique, special snowflake. Any of these things, the dynamic is possible. That list, I should have dots. I do have dots at the end of that list, because virtually anything that we can conceive of as applying to us as being desirable or undesirable, we can make if you like, make a fetish of, and say, I want this, or I want this to be done. Right? So, what happens for me here is, well, I'll come back because I haven't laid the groundwork properly yet. So, there we are. Now, what I wanted to do, I have a note here too. Does anybody confuse this use of the term attachment with the psychological, or should I just not mention that at all?
No, I think this is pretty clear for us. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Alrighty. So, is this clear? Trungpa's spiritual materialism, and of course, he tried to. Well, he didn't try to discourage it, but we'll come back to that.